to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is assumptions. We make all kinds of assumptions in our lives that actually are very functional in many, many ways because they allow us to navigate perhaps more readily in the world. But at the same time, these assumptions serve to limit our perception. So we're going to dig in and explore this world of assumption and see how we might be able to make our assumptions more visible, that we might find freedom from them. So good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you here with us this morning, and so good to have everybody else who's joining us here. Before we get started with assumptions, let's take a minute or two to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any stress, tension, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light, lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome. And good morning, April. Wow, great to have you back with us. Welcome. Today we are talking about assumptions. And most particularly, we're talking about how to make the invisible visible. So there are invisible assumptions that we operate through and with that shape our experience and yet evade our awareness. And so what we're hoping to do is to be able to find ways to expose those assumptions. And this comes from a conversation yesterday. I'm doing some consulting work with an organization that is looking to find ways into generating the world that they envision. And originally, the conversation was about how to heal, transcend white supremacy, racism, the patriarchy, the isms, sexism, ageism, although they weren't all explicitly named. And in our conversation, it was very, very interesting because that seemed like a noble endeavor. And then we got to having a richer conversation because we were looking at what is the system that is calling to be created. If you are, and we've talked about this before, but if you're directly addressing the isms, it's like playing whack-a-mole because the isms are a symptom. And so there was this underlying conversation that that was what we needed to address. But the thing is that the isms emerge from a deeper source, and we get to be looking at what the deeper source and conversation might be. How this relates to this notion of assumptions is that there's public conversation right now about addressing racism and all the isms, okay? And how directly to address those problems. We've talked a lot about the problem with problem solving. But the thing is that when you're treating a symptom, other manifestations of that symptom are going to arise. When you look at the cause, like the deeper cause, then maybe you have a shot, you know, if you get to recreate something. And then there are so many assumptions in our languaging. So when we talk about correcting the patriarchy, for example, we're talking about it as if it's a thing rather than a construct. It's a label that we have put on a certain set of a wide set of manifestations. And by using these labels in so many ways, what we're doing is making a vast assumption. And the vast assumption, the first vast assumption, is that we have a common understanding of what that label means. So we have a lot of jargon in our culture, and lots of popular buzzwords right now that are meant to be pointing at issues that call for attention. So the isms, the patriarchy, white supremacism, we talk about diversity and inclusion, which sounds like really good stuff, except we don't necessarily have a common definition of what that means. We just assume that we understand what one another means by saying these things. Even we can go so far on a whole different tangent when we talk about love or in relationship. If I can say I love you and you say you love me, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for you and what does it mean for me? We assume that because we're using the same words, we understand, or we have a mutuality of understanding. And I think that this can be a deep source of discord in our society, in our personal lives. If we look at the Constitution, liberty and justice for all. But when that was written, it didn't mean all. It meant all white men, right? It didn't mean people of color. It didn't mean women. And it didn't mean people who were enslaved. So while the words seemed overarching and expansive and inclusive, there was a meaning behind that wasn't written into those words. There was an assumption that it would not include certain people, that there were a whole collection of people that didn't qualify for all. And the assumption was so deep that it didn't have to be named. It didn't have to be for all white men, for example, because it was just a deep, deep, deep assumption. And I think that that's maybe an extreme but valid example of how we operate from assumptions. Like we assume, we have shorthand, we have code words for all kinds of things. Like one of the things we were looking at was underserved communities. And originally that sounded like, yeah, we want to serve underserved communities. Okay, great. That sounds laudable, right? But what's an underserved community? And why do you want to serve it? And when we got into looking more deeply at those definitions or those monikers, a new insight arose that there, what was the intention behind that, and what does it mean? You know, underserved communities is kind of a shorthand, a typical shorthand for communities of color. And there's an inherent, so here the desire was to be able to heal racism, yet there's an inherent racism in that kind of identification. So it's a very interesting balancing act to be able to recognize the reality of certain patterns and behaviors that are toxic, like racism. The thing is that when we talk about that, we have an understanding, or we think we have an understanding about what that means, how it impacts, who it impacts, etc. And it's beholden to us to dig more deeply into our understanding, our motivations, our assumptions, like the assumption of superiority, which generates, I need to help them because obviously I'm in a better place to be able to help them, versus to collaborate or to generate something together, to gain different perspectives, to collectively create something that's new and works in ways that we haven't seen. I hope that the nuance of this is getting communicated. It's difficult to talk about because these linguistic shorthands gain some reality of their own. They gain a presence of their own. What do you mean you don't want to combat racism? You know, like that becomes, well, wait a second, let's go back and talk about what is racism and what are we addressing? You know, we may be addressing a whole bunch of behaviors and structures that are founded in something else. And if we're looking at trying to do behavior modification, we may be effective to a certain degree, but if there is an underlying well that keeps bubbling up these kinds of behaviors, we're really just playing whack-a-mole. So how do we get at that foundation? How do we get at what that well is, the poisoned well? Maybe we get to recreate that. It was interesting too, because in this conversation, we were talking about mimicking nature. And again, assumptions arose. So for so long, people have been taught that nature is dog eat dog. It's the survival of the fittest, which from Darwin is a bastardization of what apparently he actually said, which had more to do with the fittest to survive or the most adaptable. That it's not, that nature isn't just based in competition, which is kind of what we've justified our human behavior around, the survival of the fittest. So that justifies bad behavior, that justifies toxic competition and beyond. But instead, and this is becoming a more widely understood perspective, that nature is largely, predominantly cooperative and integrated, where multiple systems are at play, supporting each other in this web of life that is deeply, deeply, deeply interwoven, interconnected, and interdependent. But it was interesting because the two different notions of nature showed up in this conversation. And again, we're talking about assumptions. We're assuming, oh, that's the truth. Nature, dog eat dog, rather than this collective and cooperative, collaborative relationship between all levels of systems. Which also reminds me, we talk about humans, and humans, we have had all kinds of notions about humans being greedy and self-serving, and yet there are studies that show, and we know this personally, but there are studies that show that people will often do things that are against their self-interest to help others. And that is part of our human expression, more so than just the greed and voracious hunger for more all the time. So the assumptions that we make color our experience. The assumptions that we make color our actions. If we're trying to do something, this is also a really good conversation. I think it's a different one though. The arrogance or the downside of doing good and fixing. So if I'm coming in and I'm saying, okay, you've got this problem, I'm going to come in, I'll be the savior, I'm going to come in and fix it. It's happened so many times with, this is again, I guess it is assumptions, with charitable organizations that are trying to fix a problem. So I remember a story about a community where the women were walking for miles to get water and spending so much time and energy and encountering potential dangers to be having to go and get this water and carry it back. And so some very well-meaning people, philanthropists, put some money together and had a well built. And it had negative impact on the community, and it also ended up not getting used. And why it had negative impact on the community interestingly, was that this time culturally, within this culture, the time that the women spent going to get the water was a time of community and communion with one another. And they connected with each other that way. They communicated, they wove together the tapestry of their community. And so the people who had only the best intentions came in thinking they know how to resolve this issue. And they imposed their assumptions that obviously if the water is local, then it's going to save people all this time and energy, and without seeing the bigger picture, without a deep collaboration with the people to look at what the deeper needs were beyond just water. And as a result, the well lay fallow. And so it's because assumptions were made. Assumptions like, I know better than you do. I know what you need more than you know what you need. And we see these assumptions at all levels. We see them when someone reacts to us in a particular way. We take it personally, typically, and make it about us, when in fact it might have nothing at all to do with us. We make assumptions, and then based on those assumptions, we then decide, well, I'm not going to talk to that person again, for example. So these things exist on all different levels. If we can catch ourselves when we're making assumptions, if we can find a way to generate curiosity rather than these determinations. Curiosity is the antidote for judgment, because then I can say, well, what's going on there? What's happening? It's an entree into discovery, and it can help us live beyond our assumptions and our judgments and our interpretations, which sometimes, maybe many times, are not wholly accurate. There's freedom available to us as we can identify the assumptions that we're making. So the assumptions, it's kind of like, I know you've heard the fish in water analogy, and the fish doesn't know it's in water necessarily because that's what it's surrounded by. That's just water, water everywhere, right? We don't even recognize it. So we don't recognize our assumptions. We don't typically recognize the underlying rhythm or baseline that's playing all the time. It's playing all the time, so we don't even hear it. We don't even know it's there. And in order to come to a place where we can truly generate something new, we get to recognize those things that are providing that baseline. We get to start bringing them to conscious awareness in order that we can actually have access to choice, to freedom. So it's very interesting. I was talking to someone else who has had a career of being visible and being seen and proving themselves And when I don't know that the proving themselves part was particularly visible until we were able to unearth some situations from childhood that then motivated this need to show how great they are, to develop this ego of success and performance in order to compensate for what the underlying source was. And like this behavior would show up in all different ways, but until like addressing each incident of the behavior isn't going to address the foundation. We needed to get down to what is the foundation motivation for all of this? Where is it coming from? And then we have the ability to make a shift. So Rosalind says, I often think the opposite of the spectrum. If I'm feeling sad, then I wonder what would open up to feel happy. I think that's a great exploration. Is like, wow, okay, I'm feeling sad. However, before we do that, we might want to look at what is it that triggered the sadness so that we can get down to the core. Because if we just go from, I'm feeling sad, what would it take to feel happy? We're bypassing, in a way, we're missing an opportunity to look at what is the driving or the inciting incident. What is it that is the underlying baseline that generated that experience? And so we can use that opportunity. And then once we use that opportunity, we can move into what would it take to feel happy? When I just operate under the assumption, so here's an assumption, or I call it a working hypothesis. So Rosalind says, good point, being aware of the trigger. Thank you. So, oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, well, what we want to be able to do. Oh, I work under the working hypothesis that if it's coming up to heal. There's an opportunity. And when we have these intense emotions, there's an opportunity for us to discover something more. There's a place, a woundedness perhaps, that we can feel more deeply into and find through the attention required, we can maybe dissolve that trigger, that response, that wound, we can heal it. So anyway, that's it for today. It's Friday, so I wish you a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And there's all kinds of wonderful programming to check out throughout the weekend and every day at Enlightened World Network's Facebook page and YouTube channel and Enlightened World Living. So as always, I'm so grateful to you for the opportunity to have these conversations and explorations and discoveries together, growing together. And I just deeply, deeply appreciate you and who you are in the world. So until next time, so much love to you.